I would like to start by talking about this image. We've mentioned that already. It's great to see it here. I've never seen this copy of it, but this is the canonical chart mapping the development of modern art that the founding director of MoMA, Alfred Barr Jr., showed or created for his exhibition in 1936. In this chart, he chose not to include VKhUTEMAS, the school that he visited reportedly 3 times during his visit to Moscow in 1927. And instead, he positioned the Bauhaus, and is there a way maybe I can point? Is there a pointer? That's okay, that's fine. I mean, I can actually maybe do this. Can people see this? So, wow, this is technology. Works? How? Like that? Yes? No? No, I just want to. I want to point. Yeah.
Right? No, this one doesn't have one. Okay, this doesn't have that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. All right. So instead, he positioned the Bauhaus as a direct outcome of the 2 movements of the Russian avant-garde, suprematism and constructivism, a kind of rather strange choice. And yet Barr could not have been more impressed by what he saw in Moscow and by extension at VKhUTEMAS at the time. There is no place where talent of an artistic or literary sort is so carefully nurtured as in Moscow. Would rather be here than any place on earth, he writes in his diary. 9 years later, Barr exhibits the works of Tatlin, Rodchenko, Lisitsky, Popova, and Stepanova, all sort of in this order along the wall at MoMA, which was somewhere else back then. All the artists that he met in 1927, all of whom were VKhUTEMAS professors, but never mentioned their affiliation with the school, something that would have been impossible to imagine if they were Bauhaus faculty instead. In fact, the works of the Bauhaus faculty were framed as its own board, along with several other objects affiliated with the school, including, of course, a Kandinsky chair by Breuer and a poster by Herbert Bayer, celebrating Kandinsky himself, who turned 60 the year of the show. But what's even more interesting is that Barr included the project by L. Lisitsky here, the abstract cabinet, as part of the Bauhaus display. And I thought that was quite strange, given that Lisitsky never officially taught at the Bauhaus, and in fact, he was a faculty at the VKhUTEMAS from 1925 on. In fact, I'd like to argue that Barr's decision to omit VKhUTEMAS did not reflect the state of affairs as they were at the time of his visit in Moscow, and certainly not at the time of the foundation of both schools. And so, in particular, I would like to address the moment that actually is before the VKhUTEMAS, something what you've mentioned, thankfully. And by the way, this is an incredible chart. I'm really, really happy you did this. I have one comment, which is I would put VKhUTEMAS in red and the Bauhaus in blue, but that's just, the personal preference. So 100 years ago, in the fall of 1918, Russia was undergoing a cultural revolution and reorganizing its entire system of higher education as one of the many steps. And the vision for this reform in art education was being shaped by the Department of Fine Arts, and the short for the department is IZO, as IZO, and I'll use this term later, so please remember it, which was part of the People's Commissariat for Education, or the Ministry of Education, called Narkompros. So all of those, there are 2 terms that are a little bit difficult to remember, but I'll use them a couple of times. So the department, led by the most progressive artists of the time, the Tatlin, Malevich, Kandinsky, were all responsible for creating the so-called new artistic culture, where artists, and I quote, should take a direct and active part in all spheres of artistic life, exactly as this photograph shows. So I'm going to talk about one of the immediate outcomes of this educational reform, the school that predated the Bauhaus, because it's founded in 1918, and which in turn, of course, predated the VKhUTEMAS and likely influenced, I think, where I would like to suggest the formation of the Bauhaus. It's a rather open statement, so something we can discuss. In order to educate this newly empowered proletarian masses, the Soviet government dissolved the several existing educational institutions. So in this case, the Academy of Fine Arts and the Applied Arts School, the Craft School, the Stroganov Institute that you've mentioned earlier, which actually has those two buildings. And so, in fact, and formed what's called the new or the Free State Art Studios, or SVKHUTEMAS. So those three buildings are as a result, become the Free State Art Studios. So the independently run assembly of those studios was founded on October 18, so exactly 100 years ago, and was not just in Moscow but all over the country. So it's a large network, and literally brought revolution in education. So mission was to make the training in the arts accessible. And I quote, anyone willing to dedicate themselves to art. It was free. It was open to formerly disenfranchised classes. And what's more exciting is that the students actually chose their own who would be nominated to become a professor, and then they chose those professors. So it was an open election. And this is where it gets really interesting. So this is actually a chart that I've recently discovered, and it's in the museum of the Moscow Architectural Institute. And it shows that they're very serious about basically having representatives of all the new trends of the avant-garde as part of the structure of those Free State Art Studios. So we have realism and impressionism, neo-impressionism and cubism and suprematism and futurism, and among the faculty are Malevich, Tatlin, Kandinsky, and others. So this is really an exciting moment. Actually, this early sign-up sheet for Kandinsky's studio reveals that there's only 4 people who signed up for Easter. And actually, it doesn't look much better for Tatlin or Malevich at that point. The people who, it's true, the people who, in fact, were doing very well are the neo-realists and impressionists, because they're, by that point, by 1980, now the people who have established studios, they have a following, they're well-known. These new guys, they've only been there for, suprematism, 5 years, by 1918, roughly. So they really are unknown. So, however, Kandinsky, actually within that fall manages to get about 50 students, and the following fall 40, and 10 of them stay with him for 2 years. So it's a rather large studio just for Kandinsky himself. And in fact, his role in the period between October Revolution and when he leaves for Germany in December 1921 is really crucial to Soviet art and culture and educational system. He is somebody who is instrumental in developing kind of the institutionalization of the avant-garde as such. So this is actually a book that he publishes as an official at ISO Narkompros, as an official in the Ministry of Culture, and it has an inscription by him to someone else, which says, create with fire, from Kandinsky. And I thought that was a really beautiful saying. It has so many different layers to it. So this book here is important because this is actually something what he wrote a few years before, and published in Germany, in Berlin, in 1913. So it's called The Look Back, and here it's called The Steps, or The Artist's Text. And Kandinsky helped develop the so-called art program of the Ministry of Education, and essentially founded what I would describe as a kind of a new cultural infrastructure that bridged museum, research, and education. So he was the founder of the Museum of Artistic Culture, he was the founder of the Institute of Artistic Culture, then also on the board of SVKHUTEMAS and was teaching there, and also was one of the founders of the Academy of Artistic Sciences, Rachen, which becomes also an interesting kind of next step for him. So he is also instrumental in establishing the active cultural exchange at this moment after the World War I between the members of ISO and the leftist German organizations, such as the Workers' Council for the Arts and November Group also. And here he quotes a letter signed by the Workers' Council for the Arts, of which Walter Gropius was the chairman at the time, in response to the Soviet Art Committee, or Collegium, as Gropius calls it, dating January 26, 1919, so a few months before the Bauhaus. So Gropius personally likely was familiar with the art program through the painter Ludwig Barr. No relation to this Barr, actually, another person, a close associate of Kandinsky who literally been delegated by the Soviet ministry to, in December 1918, to go to Germany and distribute the program, to talk about what was going on in the Soviet Union. So specifically, they say, we greet with warmest sympathy the efforts of the Moscow Collegium. We're prepared to work in unity with the Collegium and all artists of all yet unaligned nations. So this is in response to all this material that's being sent and also published. The art program was published in Das Kunstblatt in March 1919. So again, before. And it called for, and I quote, elimination of the classifying distinctions between sculptor and plasterer, painter and sign painter, the elevation of crafts to an art, fertilization of the crafts by leftist innovator. And that's by Anatoly Lunacharsky, who is the head of the Ministry of Education. Of course, striking are the similarities between the founding manifesto of the Bauhaus by Gropius, which was also founded in place of a fine arts school and general crafts school, similarly to the Moscow version. And the manifesto unveiled in April 1919 called on architects, sculptors, and painters to return to crafts, proclaiming that there is no essential difference between the artist and the craftsman, and calling to create a new guild of craftsmen without class distinction. So in fact, it's actually very much resonating, I think, with what's going on in Moscow. So how many more minutes do I have? A couple? Okay, good. So the chaotic SWOMAS experiment lasted for only 2 academic years until fall 1920. And then it was reformed, as you mentioned already, into High Art and Technical Studios, collectively known as VKhUTEMAS. It's a Russian acronym. So it became clear, essentially, after the first 2 years that there was, although it was radical in principle, that there is really no cohesiveness or Kandinsky lamented no synthetic unity within this Free State Art Studios. So on the other hand, and he writes, the new Weimar Academy, or the Bauhaus, pursued that unity, and not merely mechanically, as in our art schools, but organically. According to Kandinsky, at the newly formed Bauhaus, and I quote, every student was obliged to study all 3 arts. So that idea of interdisciplinarity was then at the foundation of this new version of, of the school in Moscow. So essentially, what's happening, I think, is that the 2 places kind of really learn from one another and, in a way, follow in each other's footsteps in many ways. So VKhUTEMAS, of course, then was a school for advanced artistic and technical training, created to prepare highly qualified artist practitioners for the modern industry. And then it's the industry and the modern industry that becomes the foundation for the following manifesto of the Gropius, for which I don't have time right now. But I'm very glad you brought up the 3 different Bauhauses because, of course, yes, here this is a specific connection to the first one. So without coordinating, we have done very, very well covering the 2 kind of, the 2 ends, the 2 bookends. So, and then, of course, VKhUTEMAS undergoes a reform. 1927 becomes even more institutionalized. And so just kind of to complete the circle with Kandinsky, one of the major things that he does is found Institute of Artistic Culture, which becomes a kind of a think tank for VKhUTEMAS and literally developing the curriculum. Specifically, he's thinking of a way of how to synthesize all those different arts and calls on a group of young architects and artists and sculptors to develop a core curriculum, kind of a version of a workhorse at the VKhUTEMAS. And they come up with this quartet, space, volume, graphics, and color, that becomes the foundational curriculum at VKhUTEMAS. In the process of doing that, they're also working with something called the Monumental Art Program that Kandinsky develops at the Institute of Artistic Culture, which is based on the analysis of our various elements of art. And the artists, these young artists like Rodchenko and Stepanova and others, at a certain point claim that, in fact, Kandinsky's approach is too subjective, and they're going to find an objective method instead. So they found an objective group of objective analysis, and Rodchenko took over Kandinsky's position at Den Hoek, thus essentially kind of forcing him out. So Kandinsky and his wife leave in 1921 to go to Germany with actually an official Soviet mission to develop a branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences, not to go to the Bauhaus. And a few months later, in the spring of 22, Kandinsky then starts teaching at the Bauhaus and becomes the longest-serving faculty of the school until 1933. So in conclusion, there are many parallels in the early history of the institution, but there are also many differences. And perhaps the main one that's sort of worth mentioning very quickly is the size of the schools. So Bauhaus is about 10 times smaller than the VKHUTEMAS, so roughly, let's say, 127 people in 1924 versus VKHUTEMAS about 1,500, so it's a very big difference, so it's a very different animal. As a result, we don't have a very kind of conceptually unified school. We actually have a very diverse place with which is very pluralist, with people who are traditionalists, with people who are so-called futurists, and between those futurists you have fights between constructivists and rationalists and suprematists, and there's quite a lot of conversations going on, and I would say rivalry. So, however, there are also a lot of similarities. So the similarities might be that there was a interdisciplinary school which had offered instructions in all the sort of disciplines of practical art, so wood, metal, weaving or textiles, glass, clay, ceramics, at the VKHUTEMAS stone sculpture, and color painting. The two big sort of differences with the Bauhaus is that VKHUTEMAS offered training in architecture and also in graphics from the very beginning. So it actually institutionalized those two disciplines as part of its curriculum rather than kind of a separate endeavor. So I actually like thinking about those two chairs, one produced, of course, by Breuer, and another one produced by Tatlin's student, Rogozhin, in about the same time, which is a really telling example of the comparison between the two schools. Of course, here we have the incredible sort of steel from the Yonkers factory, and here Tatlin would love to have steel, I think, but all he can get is bent wood, the sort of thonette style, and so he ties it with a rope, over, but it also has that same kind of give, and it has some of the plasticity of the other one. So this is one of the, I think, telling examples. And of course, the other one, the main one, I would say, is the fact that architecture was taught as this kind of new discipline. And really the biggest contribution in that front is by Ladovsky, the person you also mentioned, who developed this new curriculum of the course called Space, which I think is one of the most amazing kind of early methodologies, probably one of the first methodologies of modern architecture. Those are kind of the first iteration of the course. It's the works that he did with the students, and this is the second iteration that's done from sort of 1923 on. Then it opens up to the entire school as an interdisciplinary course, and and they do things like the Guggenheim before it ever possibly could have existed. So and work in model a lot. So this is really important as we're also working in model with our students at the Corfe Union right now as we speak. Well, they're working in model. We're here. So, while VKHUTEMAS is routinely mentioned in the discussions of the avant-garde, its seminal role within the kind of larger cultural landscape has, I think, not been properly investigated. And meanwhile, the cursory look just already tells us it was a very important place. So back to the diagram, I think despite its kind of international cultural importance at the time, VKHUTEMAS was primarily perceived as an instrument of political manipulation or propaganda from the West, on the West side, and on the local side in Russia, it was perceived as, after its closure in 1930, as a kind of formalist school, something that was not reflecting properly on the new proletarian socialist realist direction, and was also sort of completely suffered from the oblivion from from within. So that kind of double attack, I would say, basically shut down VKhUTEMAS for about, well, 30 years and then probably another 30 years, so quite a long time. And yet I would argue that was very important, and it should be in this chart, sort of somewhere here perhaps, to make Barr's diagram and the kind of overall historical landscape more complete. So I'd like to finish on this slide here. So this is my little contribution. So thank you very much.